Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything. Geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. And you can follow the show through email blasts, RSS, on YouTube, and on iTunes as well. And you can always listen later on in the week on Friday nights from 11 to 1 a.m. when it is rebroadcast on a bunch of other networks. Now, before we get to today's show, and I'm very excited about our guest for today, I just want to briefly mention that AFR, if you love AFR, if you support the work that I do and Chuck Ocelli and Ed Opperman, all the other hosts on AFR, we are in need of some funding to keep us going. We have a lot of really exciting things on the horizon, including upgrading the whole website, bringing on a bunch more new hosts. We've got a video project underway. And I'm going to be recording something, a little special podcast on all of this, hopefully later in the week, and I'll have it up by next week or the week after at the latest, sort of talking about this. But again, you know, I know my listeners and subscribers are always very generous, and if all of my subscribers and my listeners and everybody that enjoys the show, if you just, you know, gave a little bit, even $1, it helps so much. And of course, I will link up in the show notes to AFR's PayPal, so you can donate directly to us, and it really helps out a lot. But as I said, I'll be recording something on this a little bit later. But as I said, I'm very, very excited about my guest for today, and we are joined by artist Caram Kapp, who faithful listeners will remember all the way back on December 1st, 2015, episode 42 of the then just podcast, which was entitled The Homeland Hackers. And Caram is 1/3 of the Homeland Hacker group, along with Heba Amin and Don Carl. And Caram, it's so great to talk to you again. How are you doing?
Pierce, it's great to be back. I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, very good. I'm excited that we finally get to talk again. You know, we really only kind of chat a little bit on Twitter here and there, so it's great. It's great to hear your voice.
It's amazing. I mean, it's the whole difference between talking to you on Twitter and talking to you on your show. And Pierce, you have when I listen to this when I'm on the show, you have one of the scariest intros on radio. I mean, I feel like you have to explain the world to everyone now.
Oh, thank you. I know I get really mixed responses to my intro. People either love it, and I get like numerous emails. I guess I'll say it one more time. The theme song is Polaris by Cyber People. You can look that up on YouTube. And people either love it, or I get lots of I hate it, you know, get rid of it, go back to something different. But
well, it's one of the reasons I keep coming back to the show. I love this intro.
Oh, well, great, excellent. So we'll keep you in that camp. Caram, it's been, as I said, it's been a while, I guess 2 years almost, since we last spoke. And again, I really encourage people to go and check out episode 42, where Tom and I spoke, with you and Heba and Don. And I get this a lot. People will ask me, you know, what's like your favorite episode that you've done? And that's always a sort of Sophie's Choice moment, because I love all the episodes that I've done. I can't really pick one. But if I had to pick like a top 3 of my favorite episodes to record, yours is always up there. That's the one that I'm probably most proud of, in that we got all of you on, that you were listening to the show, to our podcast when we were talking about you. And that was like a true, just, I don't know, it was like a great moment, for me. But Caram, why don't you tell, the listeners a little bit about yourself? Because we've got so many new listeners since we last spoke, and tell them a little bit about the Homeland hack.
Hello everyone. My name's Caram Kapp. I am, amongst other things, a graphic designer who is currently resident in Berlin. I was born and raised in Cairo, so I have a very strong connection to that country. And in 2011, like many of my compatriots or country people, we joined in a little something we call the Egyptian uprising, which led to a lot of interesting places, which we can get into a bit later, and formed kind of an external resistance movement from Berlin, which expressed itself through media, through monitoring media as well, through graffiti arts in part, and also through a lot of events in which we brought people from the Middle East and, in this case, Germany together to simply talk. Because that's what was lacking. Everyone's following the news, of course, and everyone's watching what's going on in the country, but it was very difficult for people in Germany to actually make connections with people from Egypt and get their news from the ground, which is why I'm always very grateful for things like AFR, for instance, because I get the feeling that the news you get here is a bit, let's say, more down to earth and less sensationalistic. And after a lot of things happened, after what we can call the uprising was over, we were kind of wondering what to do. We had just published Walls of Freedom. This is a book that Don Carl and I were working on, or Owen were working on, which is the graffiti history of the Egyptian Revolution. And Don, being a well-known figure in the graffiti and street art scene, got a call from the producers of Homeland, who were at the time shooting an episode in Berlin. They were shooting the whole season here, which was supposed to be set in a refugee camp in Lebanon. And after many, many calls, he got in touch with me and said, do you want to spray on the set of Homeland? And knowing a thing or two about Homeland, I was going, no, not really. This is not something I can support. But then Don very intelligently suggested that this was maybe an opportunity we could use to express ourselves in a more activistic way. So very quickly we got in touch with Heba, who has a certain history with the research of this kind of thing, mainly. And after many meetings with the set designers and producers and so on and so forth, we were on the set. And since no one was really looking, we started spraying and tagging and writing things like Homeland, the show is racist. There is no Homeland. Homeland is not a series, which later on also got turned into a short film for some reason. And we disappeared for a while. Now, when episode, which episode?
I think it was like episode 2 or 3. I think it was pretty early on. Yeah.
Yeah, it was it was episode 2.
Yes, of season 5.
I got a slightly excited call from Don once again, who had been watching the show and told me, okay, go watch this. And then we took the show apart frame by frame and found a lot of our graffiti was on screen, which we found very strange because, I mean, usually you're covered in tons of paperwork, A, before you are allowed on set. We were not. And B, we had assumed that the production would, if they discovered this, digitally retouch our graffiti out. But this basically went to show the level of ignorance towards the subject matter with which the producers of the show were dealing with matters of language, let's say. Because, because they did allow this kind of graffiti to air. And then let's say that we got in touch with a lot of people and a lot of people got in touch with us. And it really helped us make a point about mainly American and Hollywood media and its relationship to things that are not American, in that it takes it takes a very stereotypical view, which colors whole swathes of the world in a mainly negative, or let's call it slightly backwards light.
Mm.
Yeah.
No, definitely.
And a lot of things happened. I have to admit I'm a bit over that by now because I see that the world is moving in directions that have nothing to do with the TV show and that in fact make what happens on Homeland look macabre. And I mean, coming on your show was a great eye-opener to us because it opened our eyes to a great lot of connections that we were in part aware of, but that made them actually much more obvious than they were before to us. I mean, for instance, the meetings between the producers of the show and various, high-ranking intelligence.
Yeah. Every year.
Yeah, definitely. And how they start writing the show and all of that. And sometimes it feels like they're setting the agenda for what's going to happen in American politics a year in advance and displaying it on screen. And I mean, this is also something you find in other shows, but it's nowhere as obvious as in Homeland, I think.
Oh, well, and just, quickly on that before we dive into the rest of what we want to talk about. Of course, in that season, there is a character that is, not even based. It is Laura Poitras, the journalist. And then, of course, Laura Poitras later contacted the three of you to do so. So, I don't even know if that's like art imitating life, imitating art, or what. But there's so much there. So again, I really encourage people to go check out that episode. It's a great episode. And we got you were all like in 3 different places, right? I think Heba was in Egypt.
I think I must have been either in Berlin or Istanbul at the time, and Don was God knows where. I mean, the guy, we all get around a lot, so.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, very, very exciting episode, that I encourage people to go out and look up. So for the past couple of episodes here on the show, I've been talking quite a lot about these ideas of like revolution or revolutionary thought, particularly going on here in the U.S., and the various ways in which the media has covered these, quote unquote revolutions, and the sort of media manipulation and the narratives that they spin. And, from things like Trump and Syria to O.J. Simpson and beyond. And I've also been really interested in kind of returning back to some of the earlier episodes that I covered and kind of revisiting some stories and things that we covered way, way, way long ago. So very, very faithful listeners will remember all the way back to Porkins Policy Radio episode 3, which was a democracy Egyptian style. And I'll link up to that as well. But I spoke about what was going on in Egypt, and that was sort of like in the just sort of in the aftermath of like Morsi and al-Sisi kind of, I think, vying for power and whatnot. But Caram, we wanted to kind of talk today and sort of discuss what has been going on since the revolution, if you want to call it that, or the uprising that went on in Egypt. And as you said earlier, Caram, you were born in Cairo, you grew up in Cairo, so obviously Egypt holds a very special place for you. And since the latest military coup in 2013, actually quite a bit has been going on. I know that, here in the West, you wouldn't even know that Egypt exists anymore. It's basically just disappeared as a topic of conversation, as something to cover in the media. And we're going to get to some more of what I'm just going to lay out right now. But there has been a lot going on since the latest coup. Just the other day, an Egyptian court sentenced Muslim Brotherhood head Muhammad al-Badi and 2 other leaders to 25 years in prison for their roles in organizing protests following the coup. Court recently postponed the trial of Muhammad Morsi and of other Muslim Brotherhood leaders to May 17th. So just tomorrow, actually.
Whoa.
And of course, trials continue to are ongoing with all sorts of other Brotherhood officials, and ongoing tensions between Egypt and Sudan, and to a lesser extent Ethiopia, continue to escalate. And this is something, again, is just ignored, and I'd love to get your take on that later, Caram. But let's go back a little bit to 2012, 2013, and your sort of experience with what has been, called this sort of revolution going on in Egypt. What was your sort of initial perspective on this?
On the revolution in itself. So we're back to 2011 now.
Yes.
Okay. So initially, I mean, for someone who literally was born in the year when Mubarak came to power, so Hosni came to power, this was amazing. I mean, there's no other way to describe it, because all of a sudden you had this idea that people had power, that they could go onto the street, that there was a popular voice that ran either counter or could in fact counter a very powerful state which had hitherto commanded many aspects of public and private life. And seeing these 18 days on Tahrir, I mean, this is how the initial stage of the uprising became known. Was, I mean, for someone who grew up in Cairo, knows Egyptians as well, a rediscovery of the country. I mean, not only of the country, of its people, of the culture contained within the country, of the humor of the people, because this played a very great role in revolutionary or in the revolution and in uprisings, but also of the way a state that is very entrenched will defend itself against such an uprising. I mean, one of the first things that came to my mind, at least, was, okay, this is the state opening a pressure valve for everyone to just let some steam out and let this voice be heard once, and then we'll take care of it. And going on, I mean, you have a lot of things happening. You have a lot of violence. You have constitutional referendums. You have elections. You have a whole political and cultural process ongoing, and a whole new, let's call it, pride and patriotism in being Egyptian. I mean, after the initial days, the first thing people did was clean streets that had not been cleaned thoroughly for 30 years, literally. And there was a pride in the space that people inhabited, and pride in the possibility to create a common future that was, again, freer and not necessarily dependent on social class or education or nepotism, relationships. I mean, this kind of thing plays a big role in everyday life there. And also a real excitement at the possibility of, let's call it, a democratic process, which is a whole different discussion because, as you said, democracy, Egyptian style, would probably look a bit different to democracy anywhere else style. Simply because we don't exactly have what you'd call a democratic experience.
Well, and sort of on that note too, I mean, I don't think we can deny the influence of all sorts of shadowy Western NGOs that were operating just before and then during the protests in places like Tahrir Square. You'd like the National Endowment for Democracy and the Republican Democracy Institute, and a lot of people I would say maybe preaching the benefits of democracy, but in a lot of ways seemingly sort of manipulating aspects of the protest movement to sort of better fit their own, ideas.
I mean, if you want to get into that, there are rumors that the 6th of April movement, which is a workers' movement that was founded in 2008, was trained by Otpor, who are the Serbian oppositional party, whose history I don't remember precisely right now, but who later went out and, let's say, trained many organizations in various countries after receiving training in the United States. So there are those connections. And there are rumors of connections to, let's say, Google and various other corporate or Secret Service organs between the initial revolutionaries and the people who spread the idea of this kind of revolution over social media. Media that may have facilitated the spread of this idea. But at the same time, I will also say that the revolution or uprising did not begin until people got off social media, because on the 28th, the internet was cut off in Egypt so that people couldn't get news from outside. Basically a defense move by the, at the time, government to prevent media either from inside or outside the country reaching the eyes and ears of the people. The actual uprising began when people started meeting on the streets on the 28th, after the internet had been cut off, and they were basically forced to go out to meet each other. And yes, let's say that there has always been a lot of, I hesitate to talk about shady NGOs and things like that, because they are there and these endowments are there and they influence a lot of people. But I do believe that in a certain level of political frustration on a very basic level, which had nothing to do with any other kind of influencing, all it took was basically a push for the people to go there. Of course, what happened afterwards was heavily influenced by various services.
Well, and just sort of adding on that, Caram, too, I think it became very in vogue to say that this was all a CIA planned operation, from the get-go, and the media kind of ran with that because it's sexy and it sounds exciting and it's dangerous. But I think that's sort of, and I'll freely admit I was guilty of that as well to a degree, but I think, again, this is why it's so interesting to return to these things and look at them. Yeah. I think that kind of sells the people of Egypt short, that they weren't capable of being pissed off enough at this, Western puppet, that was brutalizing them, that they couldn't protest without the CIA helping them. Or Google or Muhammad al-Baradi or, any of these sort of characters that were on the periphery and part of the movement. So I think it's a little disingenuous. And that's sort of like that weird, almost like racist sort of mentality that a lot of, people in the alt media but they're Egyptian, they can't really be, they're not really protesting. This is really some, Western guys engineering it.
Well, the French did coin the term mission civilisatrice, so the civilizatory mission of the so-called advanced states to educate us poor savages and poor heathens in more enlightened ways.
Yeah, exactly.
And thank you very much, but
yeah,
at the same time, there have been uprisings and revolutions many times over in Egypt. I mean, one was in 1917. You had one in 1952, which was in fact against colonial rule, which is when the various forces, again, this is something we can get into because it does tie into the whole narrative that's unfolding in Egypt now. When the forces of Egypt, of the Egyptian people, if you want, came together to throw out the British and the French. And so there is a long history of uprising, both against, let's say, Western puppets, let's call them that, because why not?
Yeah, that's definitely what Mubarak was.
No, I mean, also the King Farouk before him was basically a British puppet. Mubarak was heavily influenced, by American military subsidies. So we get 1.3 trillion, I think it is again, in dollars in American military subsidies, whether it's in armaments or in direct finances. So in fact, you might say that the American government is the biggest shady NGO involved in Egypt.
Yeah.
Egypt, and continues to be. I mean, this is kind of the legal point that no one takes the Egyptian government at, because they did, after 2013, put out a lot of laws against funding, against foreign funding through external NGOs, funding from the outside, basically, to keep a lid on a lot of what's going on in Egypt, because a lot of social development had gone on through NGOs that did come from outside, and not all of them are shady. I mean, it has to be said that they did fill a gap that the state was not capable of filling, if I'm very fair there. not without thoughts of, okay, let's call it cultural colonialism and expanding cultures and things like that. I mean, you do have to approach this critically, but at the same time, you can't discount the good that these people do. And on an individual level, so having worked with a lot of these NGOs, and you can call me shady for that, I don't consider myself shady, working with these people and working with the volunteers that work with them and with individuals that work there, I do believe that there is a lot of goodwill that comes from these people, and a will to learn and a will to encounter and open yourselves to other cultures in ways that would not be possible if you just stayed in your own country. I mean, it does go both ways in some way. That people retain, let's say, their own perspectives is fully understandable. I mean, if you go to Egypt, you will notice certain, let's call them deficits in ways of self-expression, in ways that the society sometimes works, and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm not going to say it's a society completely without fault, but I'm not going to say that there is not a lot of resistance that goes on a grassroots level anyway. And that once people stop making jokes, and that there was basically no way out of the emergencies that were going on in the country. I mean, starting with the state of emergency that had been going on for very long, which gave the government extrajudicial rights to arrest people, to take them to jail. I mean, I'm talking about the Mubarak government now, to censorship, to nepotism in the country, to lack of food, quite simply. Because this is even worse now. Many foodstuffs were lacking and people were unemployed and looking for work, and simply a lack of perspective in the country. I mean, if you live in a country in which you have no future, then quite honestly, you don't have much choice except other than turning to any addiction and depression, or trying to get out of it by any means possible. I mean, if I drive through Cairo in a taxi, and this still happens, one of the conversations I will have with the cab driver is usually, how do I get out of here? How do I go to a European country or to an American country, because we have it so much better here, and basically leave all this behind me, maybe send some money home to my family. But getting back to the point, there is definitely resistance that's going on, and Egyptians are capable of rising up on their own. So are many other people. I mean, this is not a Middle Eastern thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. Well, and, getting kind of zooming out a little bit, looking at a bigger picture here too. Aside from average people on the streets that were just, as you said, just fed up and really kind of like, what did they have to lose? When you're just mentioning foodstuffs and things. I mean, people should, recall back that a lot of these, like in Tunisia and also in Egypt, a lot of this was over like the price of bread had just skyrocketed to such an, just totally unrealistic price. And, a lot of these were riots that start over food, which is like the most basic of riots. And you can, look at things like, with, Marie Antoinette and France and all those, a lot of that was about food, just the basic things to live. But,
give them cake.
Yeah, exactly. But, zooming out a little bit and sort of, some of the other players involved in here, because the people aside, I think are average people are always going to be manipulated, by, government, authority and other, sort of higher up institutions. And they're sort of like this tool that they will use back and forth. And, zooming out a little bit, then we have the army on one side and the Muslim Brotherhood on the other side. And so much of what we've seen unfold since the ousting of Mubarak has really been, kind of pushing the people aside, using them for political gain here and there. But like most revolutions, it's really a fight between two or three of the actual powerful state institutions that still exist. And what we had at the end of Mubarak's ousting was the Muslim Brotherhood and the army. Mm-hmm. So let's first talk a little bit about the Muslim Brotherhood itself, because and again, this is something that it really wasn't that long ago that Muhammad Morsi was in power, and almost instantly, like a day after he's elected, there's talks about we got to get rid of him. He's evil. He's this, that, and the other thing. And then the army, which played a very smart PR game throughout the uprising and in the aftermath, because if people kind of remember back, the police were the bad ones. The police were in Mubarak's pocket, and the army was really the good guys, even though, of course, Mubarak was a soldier, was a general. What do you think the army wasn't, behind him? Yet, so the army is sort of the saviors. And this kind of gets to a lot of what, I've been talking about on the show recently is the media narratives and things, how these become constructed. But, Caram, why don't you give us a little bit of an idea of, the sort of Muhammad Morsi years, because it's become like a footnote, in history books.
It's pretty literally the Muhammad Morsi year.
Yeah. Right.
He was in power from June 30th in 2012 till, June 30th? End of June 2030 till 3rd of July 2013. I was actually in Cairo during the time when he came to power. And Muhammad Morsi was the leader up to a point of the Muslim Brotherhood. And he rose to power through the ranks and proved all his loyalties and all of that. He escaped from jail during the initial 18 days of the revolution, if I recall correctly. So putting Muslim Brotherhood leaders in jail and getting them out of it is nothing new. And that's probably where a lot of the ideology was formed, especially if you look back to the early years. Morsi comes to power and you have to give the guy this. He is by popular vote, by 51 million votes, I think, by 51% of the vote, the democratically elected president of Egypt. So people voted for him because they didn't want to vote for his main opponent, Ahmed Shafi, who was, I think, foreign minister. Or minister of
Interior, or intelligence or something like that.
Oh, look it up, people. These are things I'd rather not remember, and characters I find not very tasteful to remember. So it was a choice between Mubarak's regime and Morsi. And of course, people voted for the new regime, which was what Mubarak had for 30 years said, it's either me or the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, let's try the Muslim Brotherhood. Let's get this guy into power. And very quickly, he gets sworn in. Very quickly, there starts through the media to be spread the idea that if the Muslim Brotherhood is in power, the country will become Ikhwanized. So Ikhwan is basically the Arabic original of brothers. So in Arabic, they call the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. And that they would subvert all state institutions, that they would install all the people in positions of power, that they would have everything going according to Sharia law, that they would get rid of the secular state, which is one of the things that you could say exists to some degree in Egypt. I'm not going to get into questions of identity here. That they would subvert basically 50 years of army work, and this spreads very quickly through the media. And they say, okay, these are people who have connections to terrorists, to people who have bombed places, they will spread the Wahhabi ideology in Egypt. They will spread this, they will spread that. And through repetition and repetition and repetition, people who already are very, let's say, sensitive and absorbed and absorb what they're told through media very quickly, came to the point, okay, these guys have to go as quickly as possible. Then add to that, that Morsi in November of 2012 tried to change the constitution, had a referendum about that, declared himself outside of any kind of judicial review, outside of any kind of parliamentary power, outside of basically the word that was going around was, this is the new pharaoh of Egypt and this is how he's building himself up to be. So everyone was saying he has to go because he is illegal, because he is putting his people in power, because under him we're having more shortages in electricity, in petrol, so gas, in petrol, in, again, basic foodstuffs which were not being delivered, where you can look at who is actually controlling the flow of petrol and food and electricity, and say that maybe this was directed by what we'll call the deep state to undermine this guy's authority. And this all culminates at the point where you have the Tamarrud campaign, which begins as a grassroots campaign, but is apparently very quickly infiltrated by state powers and pushed into media, which is seeking to collect more votes against Morsi. Morsi then were given to him in the election to get this guy out of power. So there's a very strong, I won't call it counter-revolutionary, but I'll call it counter-Muslim Brotherhood movement to oust this example of non-army rule out of power and reestablish the powers that should be or that should not be, depending whom you ask, and to put, let's say, the army back in the driver's seat in a more obvious way. And this is guided through state media. This is guided through comedy. So 2012 is Bassem Youssef's best year. He's basically Egypt Jon Stewart, if you know him. Yeah, he is a very fun guy. And this is where he writes most of his comedy, which is directed at the Ikhwan and at Morsi and at his various actions. Because, I mean, he is a comedic guy. He looks comedic. He sounds comedic. He does. In meeting foreign leaders, he hardly speaks English. We are very grateful to him for the phrase, gas and alcohol don't mix, so don't drink and drive, basically, people. This is what they speak for you. For wearing a huge hat at some doctoral inauguration in Pakistan, and for grandeur that is completely not warranted, but also for not being able to speak publicly coherently. I think some people might be very familiar with this by now. For changing his mind pretty often, for trying to give himself absolute powers. I mean, the guy allegedly was trying to get all political power to himself or to himself and his surrounding circle. And for his nepotism, and this is very much enforced through the media narrative, through TV, through radio, through newspapers, which of course also creates an opposition from the side of the Muslim Brotherhood, who had been working with the police as well. I mean, but it's a whole, I mean, I don't know if your listeners recognize some of what I'm saying. This is where I'd ask you. I mean, does this sound familiar?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to say is, here comes this, I get sort of a populist leader.
Yes.
He's going to make Egypt great again. They're going to, take back Egypt. It's going to be, there were all of these talks about, sort of like, not Egypt first, but, much more sort of Egypt-centric, pan-Arabism. Morsi is going to finally stick it to the Israelis, and he's going to work, to, of course, I mean, Hamas is sort of like a part of the Muslim Brotherhood franchise. Even though they've sort of gone back and forth with that and sort of distanced themselves and then gotten closer. But this is like, he was sort of like the Donald Trump of Egypt. And I don't want to make, too many like direct comparison, because then of course it becomes this that, oh, Donald Trump is really this wonderful guy, and it's the, American deep state that is, trying to stop him. Cause I don't think that's the case, and I don't think that was really the case with Morsi either. I don't really think he was a good guy. At the end of the day, as you're just saying, I mean, he was sort of like, kind of reminded me, in those sort of early days of sort of like an Egyptian Erdogan. Using political Islam in order to consolidate power and ultimately enrich him and his friends.
But it has to be said that in many ways this has been the Muslim Brotherhood's agenda since I won't say since their inception, because we don't know what was happening in 1928. But basically part of the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology is the spread of political Islam.
Yes.
And it's also what gave them their power base. I mean, over the 90 years, almost, of their existence, they did do a lot to educate people. So you might draw comparisons with the Gulen movement, for instance.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Who does a lot of the same thing. So they build schools, they feed people, they give alms, and again, in the tradition of shady NGOs, they do the shady NGO thing and influence people towards that point of view. And of course, they have a lot of power in the countries they operate in. And they are, it has to be said, the transnational network, even though the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't operate as a Muslim Brotherhood as every country. I mean, speaking of Erdogan, the AKP and the Muslim Brotherhood do share certain similarities. And in the early days, yes, he might sound or feel like an Erdogan. And I remember him on Tahrir Square, I think on the day of his inauguration, taking off his shirt basically and presenting himself as Super Morsi, which was, which was comedic. And we left the place very quickly because it felt like it might boil over.
Well, Caram, looking at this sort of Morsi as like a, like this, maybe we'll talk about the Morsi Trump thing in a minute because, we can, because again, there is this sort of like idea that, that Morsi represented such drastic change that, something had to be done about him. And that's the line that all of the Trump, alt media people are going with, right now, that it's everybody is against him and blah, blah, blah. But let's also just keep in mind for a moment that the Brotherhood's connections to British intelligence, to American intelligence, go back quite some time. There is something there. Again, I'm not an expert. Caram, you're not an expert either, but obviously there is, they have a history. So that kind of begs the larger question of like, was Morsi sort of aware of any of this that was going on, behind the scenes? What do you think of that?
It is a very good question. I mean, I know of rumors that the Brotherhood, for instance, was handed their budget by the military. I know of rumors of collusion between the Brotherhood and the armed forces in street clashes and things like that. I mean, this I have from people who were there. And that there was some kind of collaboration between the army and the Brotherhood, especially in the first and second year of the revolution, and that this was a game that was being played out for the people's sake, and that possibly the leadership of the Brotherhood, I don't think the base would have known.
Right.
And were very much aware that they were taking part in a whole political machination, which would end up with a lot of people being sent to a luxury prison. And leading their lives there somehow, but which would lead back to the army getting, or the deep state, or whatever you want to call it, the counter-revolutionary movement to get back into power. It's not impossible at all. I don't know if Morsi himself knew. I think it's very hard to say what this guy knew or didn't know. But I think there were definitely people surrounding him that were aware of and colluding with their alleged opposition. And that all of this was in part done to give people a taste of what might happen under an Islamist. There is a difference between Islamic and Islamist. I think I need to stress that. Under an Islamist government and what would happen under a so-called alleged and secular government. Government, and simply to give people a taste of that, which was then exaggerated through media, through Cairo's rumor mill. So you have a huge and very long grapevine which moves very quickly through word of mouth, and which caused a lot of fight between old friends and families. So it was a very polarizing opinion. And it was possible to clearly divide people between the followers of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Morsi regime, or whatever you want to call it, and followers of what I'm going to call SCAF, so the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. What's forgotten in all of that is that there is, of course, a third party which wants neither the brothers, nor the army, which lost their voice in all of this. So any idea of progress and any idea of actual development in the country was reduced to a level of, no, we have to get these people out of power, we have to get these people into power. And it was basically it was a game between two very old established rivals who had been doing this since the 70s, since the 50s, obviously. I mean, for instance, in the 52 revolution, the Free Officers Club were working with the Muslim Brotherhood to get into power, but very quickly, let's say, fired the Muslim Brotherhood from power once they realized that their more secular agenda would not fit in with the Brotherhood's Islamist agenda. And that through that they were able to, I mean, going back almost, 60 years now, they were able to create themselves as the forces of progress, as the forces of stability, as the forces that would save the country, as the forces that would create a new Egyptian identity and century and decade. And I do think that they may have very well been aware of it, since this is an ongoing game between two established players, and when you sit across each other from a chessboard, you do end up talking, no matter how you move the pieces. You do talk about strategy, you do develop a certain kinship and friendship. So to answer your question, I'm going to say it's actually pretty probable. I don't want to say it's not impossible because that's weak. It's pretty probable that this was all a game to maintain some kind of status quo. The force with which it happened was unexpected. The means that the army ended up using to reestablish the power and demonstrate it were quite honestly far more than heartbreaking. I mean, if you look at things like the Rabaa massacre, which without supporting or opposing the Brotherhood, is quite simply an illegal and inhuman slaughter of 600 people. And simply the demonstrations of state power that followed the ousting of Morsi. And the war on terror that was declared, I mean, this is one of the first things, gave the state basically a position as the savior of Egypt, which it would not have had it been elected into power. In fact, they would have, so I'm talking about the army now, it would have made them deal with the dissatisfaction of the people. It would have made them deal with all the demands of the revolution. So by establishing the Brotherhood as a faction in power, they in fact created a buffer for the people to express a dissatisfaction with people who would not be the state. And direct these at people who at the end of the day didn't really have anything to say or didn't have any real power from my point of view.
No, and I think, everything you're just saying there, Caram, just I mean, screams of parallels to what we're seeing now. We're coming up towards the break, and I want to kind of get into more of this in the second hour. But, there's just so much, I love the way you were just sort of contextualizing that too with the, who's aware of what and all of that is so, again, that just screams of Donald Trump. How aware of all of this is he? Who knows? Because he's a fucking idiot. But the way, again, you were just talking about earlier, Morsi is this sort of character who was flip-flopping on lots of things. That's, Donald Trump in a nutshell, sort of towing the line. You're just mentioning these sort of rumors. And I remember reports like that coming out too, that, the SCAF and the Brotherhood were okay in the initial phases. The SCAF they were still SCAF being the military junta was still essentially allowing the Brotherhood to exist as it did, at least in those, the first maybe half of the year of their reign. So again, very, very similar, with, what we're seeing, with Donald Trump. And again, I want to expand on that more in the second hour, but it also, reminds me of, like Iran in 1979. Oh, yes. Where, you've got, again, this popular uprising, that is real, you can't just say that it was always just all a CIA plot. This was a real popular uprising, and I think just like in Egypt, one that Western intelligence and governments were sort of caught off guard with. I don't think they were really expecting it to happen the way it did and at the speed at which it did. And then what kind of happens there too? You have, again, lots of rumors that the CIA and other Western governments were sort of okay with letting the Ayatollah come to power, that he was seen as the best option moving forward. And obviously, Khomeini didn't have too much of a problem working with the Reagan administration a few times, when it benefited him. He kept those hostages locked up until after Reagan. He had no problem, with arms dealing with Israel, to help the Contras and things like that. So those parallels too, I think are really important to kind of look at. Again, too, when we look at the broader picture of the sort of revolutionary, and this political thought that's going on everywhere. Yeah. And again, too, this idea that, Morsi, initially represents hope and change, and then instantly it's manipulated into something else. He's the ultimate evil.
Though, I mean, the difference between these two situations, if we look at it simply from an electoral point of view, is that it wasn't a choice between two. I mean, neither choice was really good, but Morsi wasn't what people would consider evil. Evil. I mean, he could be in some way seen as a beneficial figure as part of the leadership of the Brotherhood. I mean, they have their whole own industry and they produce a lot of things. But to say this, the choices, between Clinton and Trump were basically, my God. I mean, it's a choice between a warmongering psychopath and the corporate takeover. So which of the two are you going to choose?
Yeah. It reminds me too, it's sort of like, do you want Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood with all of their baggage, an Islamist government, or do you want some sort of like Mubarak intelligence foreign crony, who's basically just going to do whatever, that's like the, kind of like the Hillary Clinton, in that scenario. Morsi is sort of, he's the Islamist corporate takeover of Egypt. So it's, the similarities they're in a lot of ways very spot on to what we're seeing. And I think that's because this is sort of how all this is my personal opinion, how most revolutions kind of break down. But, we are, coming up on the break right now.
Speaking of revolutions breaking down.
We will, be returning with, Caram Kapp in the second hour, so stay tuned.
practically narcotic.
Freedom.
Oh, yes, I like very much.
Radio. You're an American institution. American Freedom Radio.
And I hope people support American Freedom Radio. And I hope people vote with their dollars and really understand the value of having American Freedom Radio. Because that's my family. If you love me at all, Jack Blood, support American Freedom Radio. Like, my family has literally disowned me in American Freedom Radio. Danny and Don and those guys, those are my actual family. So please support these guys, because they have all the technology. They have all these great things that they're going to do, but obviously they can't do it all by themselves. So not only would I like to see you support them, I'd like to see you retweet them and repost them and really get involved and get on the bandwagon, so to speak, on doing that do-it-yourself promotion, because they're a do-it-yourself radio network, and we just need that so much.
Did you know there are 3 million edible food plants on Earth, and none have the nutritional value of the hemp plant? HempUSA.org offers you hemp protein powder. It does not contain chemicals or THC, is non-GMO, and is 100% gluten-free. Hemp protein powder burns fat, builds muscle, contains 53% protein, and feeds the body the nutrients it needs. Call 888-910-4367 and see what our powder, seeds, and oil can do for you. Only at HempUSA.org. HempUSA.org introduces 3 brand new detox formulations of micro plant powder. Brain Fuel for depression, bipolar disorders, and stress. Total Care, anti-cancer agent that cleans the liver and organs and increases memory. Rejuvenate, invigorates and heals the body, mind, and spirit. These products are your alternative to pharmaceuticals. Call 888-910-4367 and like us on Facebook. We ship worldwide. Only at HempUSA.org.
This is Rick Simpson, and you're listening to American Freedom Radio.
What about show business? Show business, completely dishonest, corrupt, and full of shit, but in a nice way. Plenty of expensive drugs and perverted sex. If you're going to be full of shit, might as well enjoy your work. Then you have the media. Not just the news media, let's include them all. The media are almost literally exploding with bullshit because they're located right at the crossroads of all the other bullshit. The media are made up of equal parts advertising, politics, business, public relations, and show business. These people are sitting right at bullshit junction. There's enough bullshit in the media for Texas to open a branch office. And you still have enough left over to start 2 law firms and a Christian bookstore.
What has American Freedom Radio ever done for us?
Provide us with free education?
Well, that's obviously effective, but apart from reversing the dumbing down of America...
All the information they provide is free?
What about the free podium for broadcast activists to speak from, man?
Exploiting commonplace corruption?
They help vulnerable people who don't have a voice?
Bringing light to important information nobody else does.
Or they never censor, hang up, or cut off their guests? Well, that's no fun, is it?
Oh, they created a fantastic alternative media source during an era of bad, manipulative, and infiltrated mainstream and alternative media shows and scum?
Okay, well, apart from the free education, free information, free podium for broadcast activists to speak from, exposing commonplace corruption, helping vulnerable people without a voice, bringing light to important information nobody else does, and creating a fantastic commercial-free alternative media source in a sea of bad, manipulative mainstream and alternative media shills and scum, what has American Freedom Radio ever done for us?
Donate to American Freedom Radio today. No rules, no rules, no taboo topics, no taboo topics, no fear of doom, no fear of doom. We are American Freedom Radio, American Freedom Radio.
Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything. Geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming
to you live from New York City. Your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to Porkins Policy Radio. I am your host, Pierce Redmond. If you are just joining us right now in the second hour, we are joined by a friend of the show that faithful listeners will remember all the way back from episode 42, and that is my friend Caram Kapp, who's one of the Homeland Hackers. He's a graphic designer and was born and raised in Egypt, and we have been speaking about Egypt, specifically the uprising, the revolution in Egypt, and the aftermath, which has a lot of eerie similarities to what we are seeing taking place right now in the U.S., and I suppose in other countries, but in the U.S. in particular. And Caram, towards the end of the first hour there, we were sort of getting into some more of the sort of Trump Morsi comparisons, but there's maybe even more to that. In that, what we saw with Morsi's government was the slow takeover by the military, and to the point where obviously they ousted him in a coup, and another general of the Egyptian armed forces, General al-Sisi, was put in place. So basically back to square one with Mubarak.
The full revolution.
I'm sorry, say again, Carm?
It's a full revolution, 360 degrees, yay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. No, well, yeah, which is, my listeners probably get sick and tired of me saying that, but that's what a revolution is. It's just starting at point A and ending at point A. But, again, some of the similarities that we see here where, you have a Donald Trump, this sort of, Morsi-like populist figure who's going to be, totally different, and he's going to make America great again. And he too has surrounded himself by generals and all sorts of military people. There's no more like quote unquote civilian control of the armed forces in America right now, where we've got generals and stuff in charge of the Defense Department, in charge of the Department of Homeland Security, and those sorts of things. And those, again, the parallels are so eerie with Egypt too. And Caram, maybe quickly you can kind of give us a little bit of a flavor for how this revolution, went 360 degrees, and and what. What's going on right now that the military is back in power?
Actually, I have to say something first. I mean, one of the differences between the U.S., from what I can tell, and Egypt is that the civilian institutions in the U.S. are actually stronger than those in Egypt. I mean, in Egypt, the army was never out of power, and it does take over, or through surrogates takes over key posts in the government. And the difference that I see here is that you're now installing the military people to your government. I mean, if we talk about Morsi, it's very hard. I mean, during the break, I started looking up whom did he surround himself with, who's his close circle of advisors and things like that, and it's hard to find out in 5 minutes. But we can assume that he was on the horn with figures of the deep state some of the time, if not a lot of the time. I mean, how all of this ends, how Morsi's era in power basically ends, is that on the 3rd of July 2013, after a referendum and many other things, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, surrounded by various figures of Egyptian civil society, let's call it that. So he has the Coptic Pope, he has the Sheikh al-Azhar, he has various figures from government surrounding him, proclaims that the army is taking over power. Now, according to I think the Americans had a hard time calling it a coup at the time because they were to stop supporting that government, basically. But in effect, it is a takeover by the military / state / by the figures that have been running the show all along, and an obvious one. What happens in very quick succession to that is that some squares in Cairo and various other cities in the country, so you have squares occupied in Alexandria, you have squares occupied in Ismailia, in Tanta, and various other cities, like I said, are occupied by supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood or Muslim Brotherhood members, who, of course, are demonstrating the legality of their president, because whatever you want, he is still the elected president of the country, who has been ousted from power by a military takeover. And you have a long period in which there's back and forth between security forces and those supporters, which very quickly in August culminates in what to my eyes is still one of the most blatant and shocking displays of state power ever seen. I mean, over the years, you've had tear gassing of civilians, you've had unlawful imprisonment, you've had people being carted away, you've had people being rebranded from being revolutionaries to being the opposition to being terrorists. But now the state security forces go out and without much warning, I mean, there were talks before, but on the morning there was no warning, go out to cause bloody havoc on the streets of Cairo and Rabaa Square. Here and demonstrate, okay, we're back, we're in power, we're taking, we're killing about 600 people and imprisoning 4,000 on one day. And the witch hunt goes on against the figures of, so the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, Muhammad Badi'a, who is at the time the Murshid, so the supreme leader, okay, of the Muslim Brotherhood is stuck in, is put in jail. The leadership is put in jail, as you were saying. Very stiff jail sentences are later pronounced against these people. The retrial of Mubarak begins sometime at the time. I mean, the man's now free, just so everyone remembers that.
Oh, yeah, no, I'll link up to, in the show notes, but there's a new photo of Mubarak on his birthday, and he's just, surrounded by friends, he's just chilling, what looks like a very, very nice, Heliopolis?
Heliopolis, I mean,
yeah.
This is where he has his residence, I assume.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad I didn't see these pictures. I don't want to see these pictures, but honestly, because I was telling you this before we started talking live, these are very painful moments for me to remember, because personally I put a lot of hope into this. I put a lot of work into this and a lot of time into this, and it's hard to remember these times without getting depressed, because it's a lot of possibility that basically got squashed by people who are trying to maintain the status quo and are doing it quite successfully. So since that time, I'm the end of the Muslim, let's call it Muhammad, of Mo's year in power. Power is basically a bloody massacre, a war on terror, media brainwashing of people, because now you have the war on terror on 24/7, even on all state-run channels and a lot of independent-ish channels. You have newspapers talking about the many crimes of the Muslim Brothers. You have again bombings against churches that are going on. I mean, I don't want to get into talking about Coptic minorities, because that's a whole different topic. I mean, it plays into it, but it's a whole different topic, and it's a big one. So basically, what was I saying? Sorry, I got.
Well, no, I mean, you're just sort of mentioning the war on terror stuff, and that's again something that obviously, historically speaking, there has always been connections to terrorism and things. And obviously Ayman al-Zawahiri, Egyptian, was imprisoned. There's Ali Muhammad. There's a whole bunch of these cast of characters that, are on the periphery of Egyptian society and government and involved in terrorism and things of that sort. But I will say that it was only really after Morsi is overthrown that we start to see things like ISIS appearing in Egypt. There have always been, groups with it, like in the Sinai, that have blown up pipelines, but that was less so, based on religious ideology and more based on the fact that, there's a lot of money to be made in the Sinai Peninsula, and the people that live there aren't really getting any of that money.
Oh, yeah.
Much in the same way that, the quote unquote terrorists in the Niger Delta are really fighting against the fact that, Nigeria makes a lot of money off of the oil there, but those people don't see any of it. But now all of a sudden it's ISIS is all over the Sinai. ISIS is blowing up that plane, which was, became a centerpiece of Homeland that year.
Here we are again.
Right, exactly.
You also
talk about that a little.
ISIS, I'll say, is a side effect. Yes, you have the brave Egyptian military defending the Sinai Peninsula against the evil forces of the Islamic State in the Shem, in this case. So it's ISIL, actually.
Yes, right.
ISIS is actually the Arabic translation, but that's a different point. You have the military protecting people from the remnants of the evil Muslim Brotherhood, which is now, of course, because they pose a terrorist organization. You have suddenly the police appear again on the street. They were gone for a year.
Right.
And they're no longer under Mubarak's control, so these are the good guys. And under Morsi, again, one of these things that appears that you get crime reports. People are getting mugged in the streets. People are murdered on a daily basis in Cairo. My God, why did we not know this before? And basically all of this is suddenly gone again. The country is apparently safe. And through many levels of media and opinion manipulation, basically the state, at first with support above all, so the deep state in this case, with a lot of support from, at first, the, let's say, more affluent classes. ISIS reestablishes itself in power. Of course, people have been losing a lot of money in the past 2 years. So there's a lot of business people, especially, who are happy to see them come back. But they realize that they need to keep the broader population in check. So they say, okay, we're going to start programs of distributing bread. We're going to work on better education, on better security. And they really do run very much on a security ticket at that point. And say, okay, we're the only forces that are going to protect you from terrorists, from Islamists, from the powers that are not secular. We're going to protect the Sinai, protect you from Israel. Even though, oh my God. This is my opinion, but this is very hypocritical to say, as the Egyptian military, which has signed various agreements with Israel and Israel, that you're going to protect people from the Zionist enemy once again. How? But basically it's a whole series of opinion manipulations, possibly false flag bombings to reestablish the military deep state as the power that should be in power, that should be controlling the destiny of the country, that should be defending people's rights, and that it's worth giving up your freedoms for, just so that they can run the country, quote unquote, properly, and in a way that is in the best interests of the people. And in this time you have I mean, for a while you have a lot of long live Egypt. I mean, it's like your MAGA slogan. I mean, it's make America great. It's basically long live Egypt for us. And it has been for the past 50 years. And celebrating the glory of the military. I don't know if they did any military raids. Yes, ISIS in Sinai is one of the factors, but I won't say it's the deciding factor. And it's the overall push of a narrative that was in a way more controlled by popular opinion towards a more state-run and more regulated. Is that even regulated?
Well, you know, again, I'm seeing so many of these sort of parallels to what we have here, where it's like, no, listen. The military is good, okay? The military is okay now because we've got the right people in place. And yes, there are some evil deep state actors manipulating, but really, you know, Trump will fight them off and he'll drain the swamp and it'll be okay. You're just mentioning before, the police sort of disappearing and then coming back and everyone is fine with them. You know, under Trump, the police are good. You know, there's no more of these daily reports of police brutality and violence. And don't believe for a second that it's because it's lessened. You know, if anything, it's probably increasing because nobody is covering it. You know, so they don't have to be so careful about things. But it's exactly the same where, you know, all of a sudden there's this, fighting Assad is okay. Going to war is fine. All these things become normalized again. I think in much the same way in Egypt, you had this moment of, wait a minute, you know, isn't the military supposed to be the bad guys? And now all of a sudden but they're protecting us from ISIS in the Sinai. Yeah. They're investigating these mysterious bombings of, like, you know, Coptic churches and other things.
And aren't police stations getting bombed? My God. The police must really be in a rough spot. We feel compassion for them. And I mean, one of the things that your recent discourse around the FBI is going to do is basically establish the FBI as a force of good in many people's eyes.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that the FBI can do good. You know, as long as the right people are there, then this, you know, powerful, and, you know, people, let's face it, the FBI does not prevent crime. They're really in the business of creating crime in order to, you know, stop it at the last minute. And just as a domestic, intelligence gathering source. That's really what they serve.
Yes. I mean, you know, again, parallels, we do know a thing or two about state security and surveillance and things like that. I mean, I held a talk in 2014 about how the German government and I think the American government, I don't recall the exact details of it, I have the presentation lying around somewhere, were helping the Egyptian state security improve their surveillance of social media. So Facebook, Twitter, all of that was all of a sudden much more monitored than it had been before. I'm pretty sure that beyond the parallels, you'll find a lot of the methods that were tried out in countries like Egypt are also, I mean, when we're talking about surveillance and security, after having been tested in, again, pardon me, us poor backward countries, and having been proven there, are being implemented in places like, you do now have increased surveillance capabilities, I think, for your security services, and even legal surveillance capabilities for them. I think. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, no, absolutely.
That all of these things are being, after having been tried out there, basically being implemented on a large scale in the US, in European countries, and all over the place. I mean, might also almost say that, like Palestine is Israel's weapons testing ground.
Yes.
All of this uprising and revolution and all of that was an exercise for, I don't want to say Western, but I'm afraid it's Northern security forces to try out new methods in crowd control, in opinion manipulation, in social engineering, basically.
Oh, completely. I mean, look at just the whole, shutting the internet off.
Yeah.
Just that alone. I mean, the real sort of test case for that was Egypt in 2011. No one had really done something, or not that we know of, to any extent like that, the way that, Mubarak did. And then the same, there's all of these like tech companies, that sell all of this sort of, software to monitor and things, and, even like the Tor network, and you get all these people. But what they don't tell you is that really what they do, they sell that to a lot of these secular Arab dictators. They get to test it out, they get to run it, figure out the quirks, and then they just bring it back home, and you sell it to like the New York City Police Department. And look how well this worked over in Cairo. Imagine what you can do with it here.
I mean, maybe they ought to have some kind of a quality seal, put 1,000 Egyptians in prison. So that makes it good.
Right, exactly. Caram, I want to get to the media quickly, but there's one other little thing that I wanted to just touch on, because again, it reminds me so much, and I just hope people are sort of seeing the parallels here, because they do exist. We've also got
at this point.
Say again?
If anyone's listening at this point.
Yeah. We've I mentioned at the top of the first hour these sort of ongoing tensions between Egypt and Sudan, which really are escalating to, there's reports of Egyptian soldiers shooting and killing a bunch of Sudanese miners. A lot of this has to deal with a contested area called the Halayeb Triangle, which is in southern It's southern, eastern Egypt, northern Sudan, right on the Red Sea.
Yeah. I'll have to say, by the way, you know more about this than I do, so I have to take a pass on that one.
Oh, well, all I was going to really say is just that it reminded me instantly of just like, when you get a new leader in power, like an El-Sisi, who Donald Trump has praised numerous times, including, just today, talking about how great he was. And it's just sort of like, well, let's just find a weaker foreign country and just start an issue with it, And of course, Egypt and Sudan have a very long, complicated history. They used to be one country. Yeah. Many, there's a lot of in Egypt, and the sort of like the upper media class and stuff sort of talking about Sudan is really just sort of like an extension of Egypt. And it just sort of reminded me of, kind of like the Mexico and the U.S., kind of creating this like problem, and we're gonna, we got to build a wall, we got to, and Sudan is, taken steps, al-Bashir has sort of cut off all Egyptian imports. They've reversed all of these sorts of laws that they had put into place earlier about, freedom of movement and being able to own land in either Egypt or Sudan. And it's just sort of, again, reminiscent so much of what we see right now with Donald Trump, and just, pick a country and we're just going to go after them, with every little thing. And build up military forces. And I mean, this is like crazy. I don't know. I think it's a little bit sensational, but Sudan and Ethiopia, which are in the midst of making, the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, which could, be, I don't know, not so beneficial to like the Aswan Dam in Egypt. They've supposedly, according to Sudan and Ethiopia, the military security services there believe that Egypt is going to strike Ethiopia in a military strike to stop this dam, and Egypt is trying to build a base in Eritrea, Ethiopia's arch enemy. So again, Caram, there's so many sort of bizarre parallels and things going on back and forth. And quickly, anything on just like the dam stuff, because I know that's a big deal in Egypt, that they don't want to lose sort of control of the Nile River.
I can't give you very much on that. I mean, I know that the Renaissance Dam, it's ironic that it's called Sed al-Nahda, which and the party And Morsi's project for Egypt was called the Nahda project, so it was a Renaissance project. But I guess there are only so many words you have for things. But I know that it's a problem. I know that water in the region in general is gonna be, I mean, it will be miraculous if wars don't break out over that in the coming 10, 20 years. And I do know that the Egyptian state is pretty worried about what's going to happen to Nile water. I mean, even though I think the Aswan Dam does secure supply for a number of years.
Yeah.
But, again, this is something that I ask myself when I hear this, is how much of this is actually show and how much of this is actually policy in some way. Because from my observation and from my experience, there's always a big difference between what a state publicly says and does and what's actually going on behind the scenes and behind closed doors. And this is even more so in Middle Eastern countries, I suppose, than it is anywhere else. I mean, there's so many deals being made per minute that it's hard to say. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's being used as a topic to flame opinion on and to flame opinion on. You guys know what I mean, and to polarize people and cause a nationalistic sentiment, basically. But what the real truth of this or what's really happening is hard to determine, except that people need water. I mean, I haven't been following this story, but in all three cases you've been talking about, I can see basically a country trying to tell its people, okay, this is actually our thing, and this is what separates us from them. And, I mean, basically picking on a different state, whether it be weaker or stronger, is the basic autocrat's playbook. I mean, first you create an enemy and designate them clearly so that your people see a clear opposition to their values, to their way of life. I think that's a very nice wag the dog moment there. To their way of life, to their way of thinking, to their possibility of development. And then cause an aggressive moment with them and maintain tensions. And do this to a point where most of your people who are influenced by media, by what they hear on the streets, by what they hear from friends and family who probably follow the news on some level, but without having any actual contact with the opposing party. It's very easy to form an opinion. Very easy to say, oh, they're the bad guys, they're the assholes who are gonna take away our water, who are gonna take away our jobs, who are gonna take away our industry. It's very easy to fall into that kind of trap. And it's something that it's honestly hard to avoid if you've never been exposed. And this is part of what we were getting at in the Homeland Hack, that if all you see of another population is negative images, which are reinforced by news reports, which are reinforced by popular opinion, which are reinforced by basically every source that you encounter in whatever media filter bubble you're living in, then it's very easy to manipulate these people into following whatever agenda you have. I mean, I know that the Ethiopians have their own problems with the government as well. And that the Ethiopian government might be using this as a means of control. I'm not even going to get into Sudan, which is an absolute. I don't want to curse, but
no, you can curse. You can curse, Caram.
I don't feel like cursing. I've been cursing all day, but it is an absolute clusterfuck.
Yeah.
Of a country right now. If you look at South Sudan, if you look at Sudan itself, what they did with the country is basically create another division where maybe none was really necessary.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I do have friends who watch Sudan pretty closely or are from Sudan, so it's not pretty to hear the stories that are coming from there, but as a state, you want to control your people somewhere. There are gentle ways of doing this, which is what, for instance, Germany is pretty good at. And there are obvious and blatant and very brutal ways of doing this, and of inciting people against each other, and of creating fear. And that's basically what I see both with Sisi, with Trump, with a lot of people, with a lot of leaders right now, of either change or of loss or of violence by a third party whom, in the best of cases, you're never going to see. I mean,
exactly.
Let's put it this way. If a terrorist attack happens anywhere, it's very difficult not to say, okay, how did this get through all the levels of secret services? How did this get through all the levels of monitoring that happened beforehand? How did this get through this, and this? Is this not really something that you, power, want us, public, to see and take in like this? I mean, we can go back all the way to 9/11 and the truth about that and the truth about that. I mean, this is basically where our current story begins to me.
No, and
Middle East or America or wherever.
No, and excellent point too you're just making there in terms of like creating enemies, because and right now, Egypt is accusing Sudan of harboring Muslim Brotherhood members. Sudan is accusing Egypt of supporting various rebel factions all over Sudan, and just so people understand the importance of water in the region and everything. The Nile River, runs through Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, Uganda, Congo, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and Eritrea in some capacity, and all of them believe that they have the rights to that water. So, it's a huge issue, and it's one of those amazing political issues that, never gets old. No. We all need water, and we can all kind of fight about it, and we can all blame one another. They're the reason that we don't have, crops, and they're going to destroy us, and we need to do this and that. So, all that stuff. But Caram, quickly, because, you're talking there before, again, about the way the media is creating a lot of these narratives. What is like the media situation right now in Egypt as we see it? Because that also seems to have kind of done a bit of a revolution, and sort of ended up right back, I assume, where, state broadcasters are praising, al-Sisi. That's never stopped. So what's the media situation like?
But al-Sisi is very praiseworthy if you're on state media. He keeps doing work. He gives you things to talk about. I'm pretty sure that press releases are reported more or less verbatim in some of these places. What I wanted to say a bit earlier was there was this phrase going around during the uprising that the wall of fear had come down. And basically layer by layer and brick by brick, it's being rebuilt. So if we look at media in Egypt right now, it is mostly state media or independent media that is in collusion with the state. There are after a lot of time, 5 years basically, in which you had an explosion of media, whether it be people talking on places about things they hadn't talked about before, whether it be citizen journalists who did a lot of work to get, let's say, a street level point of view out of the country, whether it be street artists who at every opportunity possible went out and either wrote a wall newspaper and expressed public opinion in the street in a very traditional way in some ways. The idea of a wall newspaper is ancient, and reaching people on the street and transmitting this kind of media is pretty important. Where you have, over 160 journalists in prison. I need to check my numbers on that. But you have a state in which it's very hard to get any kind of objective reporting in Egypt, except if you look sometimes to the foreign press, which is still allowed to operate, though under great suspicion. And you also have a couple of foreign correspondents in jail. And people are basically censoring themselves now in ways that they didn't before, for fear of repercussion. So there's a lot, again, that's being unreported. I'm not going to say that, I mean, I do occasionally come across a critical news report, especially in the English language press, though they have also increased in the Arabic media. But let's say that you can't voice an opinion as bluntly, quite honestly, as you could a few years ago. And that people are extremely polarized and extremely suspicious of each other. I mean, if you see something, say something may sound familiar to some people. And for a long time, there's been this idea of a very streamlined and very sane society in Egypt, in which people, if they somehow fall out of the norm, and if they do things that are strange, are viewed with suspicion and derision, or in some cases being reported to secret services or police, who are usually, let's say, unless it's something really awful, usually don't care that much. But it's this whole idea that people have been turned into a lot of little brothers. I mean, you have Big Brother, who is the state, who does watch everything. But it's become very easy through, again, social media. Play a great role in this, and the various phones that we carry around with this, and simply the ubiquity of technology. To have a lot of people who either consciously or unconsciously report on things they find uncouth. There's a nice word. But if we go back to the overall media, I mean, there's one Twitter account that I love a lot. That is CAPMAS, which is basically the statistical office of Egypt, who in their Arabic language account, behind every tweet, do tweet, long live Egypt. So this is basically the idea that the way that most things are being reported. That being said, there is slightly more space for debate than there was before, but things have gone back, like you were saying, in a revolution, to a place where it's very difficult to openly discuss religion and politics once more. It's more difficult to make jokes about it in public. I mean, if we go back to Bassem Youssef, it was one of the first casualties of the Sisi takeover. So no more jokes about politics, I'm afraid. And simply the discourse, if we look at it on a media level, has gone from being governed by the popular discourse to being once again governed and taken over by the state's discourse and what it wants to tell its people, rather than listening to what the man, woman, child, whatever on the street have to say. So it's become very restrictive, and people don't have the freedom of opinion either in public spaces, because, I mean, you do have new laws against demonstration which were passed, getting away from the media again. And so the right of assembly has to a point been suspended. Which is, one of the casualties of a war on terror and the suspicion against terrorists and the security state, basically. And you have to be a lot more careful when meeting, but you also have to be aware that if you write your opinion on social media, you might have security forces knocking on your door. And this is part of media as well now, that people express themselves in social fora and are supposed to be able to do so freely because, again, it's a public forum if you write a post on Facebook or not. And you should be able to do this in the knowledge that you're not going to get state security or security services or whatever organ you have knocking on your door, or to arrest you basically and harass you because of this. So that's again another restriction on media and public opinion. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Excellent answer, Caram. Well, I know it probably kept you longer than you wanted to. But quickly before I let you go, unless you want to stay for
I'm enjoying this.
Oh, okay, good. Well, then in that case, Caram, we, as you said, we keep kind of coming back to this idea that Egypt is sort of right back where it sort of started. We've got a military dictatorship back in power. Any of the sort of, progress that was made in terms of citizen journalism or independent media. I mean, there is no more independent media in Egypt. I mean, there's sort of the sort of beginnings of it. But now, I mean, believe me, I was sort of going through some of the online Egyptian press, in the past couple of days, and, all the articles are sort of the same. Even when you read, like Egypt's only independent English language newspaper, it's basically the same as like, Al-Aram, which is like one of the state-owned, newspapers. The articles are all basically the same. There's really not much difference.
Yeah. No, I mean, their editor-in-chief was, fired in 2013, and he did, and he was a lot more independent than the current one. I don't know what his name is off the top of my head. But, I mean, a friend once told me that basically Sisi invites this is maybe one parallel that we don't have, that Al-Sisi does the media the pleasure of inviting them all over to our version of the White House, basically, once a week, and basically tells them, okay, guys, this is what you're going to write about this week. And they do. I mean, after that, I should not say this. If Trump is listening to this, he'll start doing this. Damn it. I mean, let's say that with possibly the exception of one media organization, which is MetaMask, which is independent, and whatever you think of WikiLeaks has the right to publish them in Egypt and so on and so forth. And let's say they're independent of the state and leave it there. Okay. But, basically any dissenting voices, have been quenched. I mean, let's put it this way. I don't know if you're familiar with Kurt Tucholsky. He's a German writer who was around in the 20s to 40s. And one of the things that stick in my mind from him is always that there are states in which, basically the crime is not the pile of trash on the street, but the man who reports it. And this is where we're at right now. That it's almost impossible to report if you're in the country. Outside, of course, you're a foreign influence and and you see all this from outside, you're not on the ground. So, voices like mine, understandably, by the way, I mean, I haven't been to Egypt since 2015 now. 15, yeah. You now, have a very skewed opinion of what's going on the ground, even if you talk to people. But it's basically a state of media repression, of a standardized press release, which is broadcast through most media, and of a debate that has nothing much to do with the current political developments in the country or the possible hopes of the people. I mean, there's an election coming up pretty soon, which Al-Sisi is probably in classical Egyptian style gonna win with 90%, 90% of the votes. And no one's really gonna complain about this. I can already see this happening. I mean, I hope to be proven wrong. I keep saying this. And I do here and there see certain projects, let's say, that are not government projects, which are not too bad. But then again, they're offset by a huge number of government projects which are not good. Though maybe a bit more climate friendly. Friendly than some of the things I see pushed by Trump. I mean, the whole idea of going back to coal, even if it is clean coal.
Yeah, if that exists.
Or fracking or things like that, or things done with the Dakota Access Pipeline. I mean, even without advocating for or against climate change, if the technology is there, it's not a bad idea to use this technology to, let's say, sustain our way of life on this planet a bit longer. And there are projects by the government which do go in that direction. I mean, Egypt is lucky in that it has a lot of solar power. I think there are a couple of nice solar farms that are being built. So it's not all entirely bad. Okay. I try, when I talk about this kind of thing, not to paint a really black and white picture, because it's easy to fall into a very polarized mode, which is very outraged, and say, oh, these guys are assholes. Yes, they are, but this and this and this. And I mean, getting away from media, what people still on a very anarchic level in a way are hanging on to is freedom of entrepreneurship and to create new companies and things like that. Because since it's become much more difficult to, let's say, cooperate with foreign countries and with export and things like that on a small scale level, people are forced to create new in-country industries. Yeah.
Well, I guess, sort of on that note, Caram, where is that one of the directions that you see Egypt going in? And obviously this is like an open-ended sort of a question. There's a lot of, what ifs and stuff, but Egypt, has always been, particularly culturally very important to the Arab world in terms of music, cinema, it's just style in general. Egypt has always been, very important within the Arab world. And do you see that, do you see that continuing in any way? Because it really does seem like Egypt is just sort of like this, the forgotten child of the Arab world right now. So much more attention is on Syria for obvious reasons, or Libya. But Egypt has just sort of fallen the wayside. Where do you see it moving forward?
Tell me something, Pierce. We're not talking about Tunis.
But I mean,
I'm just making the point that Tunis is where all of this began.
Oh no, I was actually on one of my notes was, what about, exactly. And they were allowed to have an Islamist government and is still in place.
But the democratic process and the way they implemented their constitution and things like that is very different to Egypt. Also because it's a much smaller country with, I'm not going to say no real geostrategic value or any real natural resources that people would fight over. But if we're talking about Egypt, I see that, how do I express this? I see that one of the deficits in Egypt currently is a great loss of education, a dumbing down of the people basically, and that that a great mass of the Egyptian population is being kept uneducated. I won't say stupid, but undereducated and without any real perspective for them to either create, influence culture or improve their own attachment to culture. And this is something that's prevalent throughout many layers of society. But that at the same time, it's difficult. Egypt's influence on the Arab world has definitely diminished.
Yeah.
Especially if, basically it's become a vassal state almost of Saudi Arabia by now. and it's being influenced by that culture. And I can't, if we're talking about cinema production, about music or things like that, there are a few artists that come to mind immediately, but I can't really think of anyone who is, for instance, stature of an Kulthum. So she is still one of the most revered figures in Arabic pop mythology, let's say, or the Egyptian cinema industry producing but look, I don't want to talk about this and be unfair to it from a point of ignorance. Okay? I know that a lot of culture is being developed, that many other countries are more prominent right now, but the whole especially if we look at, if I talk about my own experience in Germany, I mean, I used to lead a cultural organization dedicated to promoting Middle Eastern culture and connections between the Middle East and Europe. The interest is simply no longer there. It's no longer as obvious, and you have to dig a lot deeper, and if you don't speak Arabic, it becomes a lot more difficult. And if you're not, the joke in Cairo is always that you have a very tiny circle there of about maybe 1,000 people out of 25 million Indian who are engaged in arts and culture. And that for a while, this circle really grew and expanded and became international. But then let's say that the forces of the market discourse simply went to another place, and Egypt was no longer as entertaining to watch either on a cultural level, because you didn't have this massive resistance movement. There was no more street art to report on. There was no new wave of filmmaking to report on. There was no new wave of music coming out of it. There was no academic opinion. But again, I'm talking about this from a point of slight, I won't call it entire ignorance, I'll call it my current observation, without having the whole picture. Okay? And it's hard to get the whole picture. If we're talking about media, speaking about fake news, it's very hard to call any news not fake if you don't follow other news as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Caram, we're coming up right towards the end, and I would be remiss if we didn't give you a chance to tell everybody where they can go to follow your work. You recently sent me a really interesting article that you wrote on your blog that I definitely encourage people to go and check out. So, Caram, tell everybody where they can follow you and where they can find your work.
You'll find my work in a number of places. I will shill one book, which is Walls of Freedom, since we're talking about alternate histories, which Don and I work together. We mentioned that at the beginning of the show. It's called Walls of Freedom. So look that up online. I really recommend it if you want to go very deeply into media narratives, the Egyptian revolution, and the time we've been talking about through the show. Me personally, you can find my rantings and ravings and currently articles on computer gaming and some calligraphy on caramk.blogspot.com. So yes, I do use Google for my blogging. Shame on me. You'll find me as .ck on Twitter if you feel like talking to me. And I tend to keep a low profile for personal reasons, but you'll find me popping up every now and then.
Excellent. And I encourage everybody to follow Caram on Twitter to check out his blog and definitely check out his book with Don Carl, which I would love to get my hands on a copy of that soon. And of course, all of that will be linked up in the show notes. Thank you, Caram, for joining me today. Thank you for the 2 hours, which is
I got to made it.
Yes, we did. Well, I will be coming back to you next week, listeners, with Stephen and Joyce Singular. We're going to be talking about a new documentary on Netflix all about JonBenet Ramsey. So until then, I will be talking to you very soon. Yeah.
news and information you can trust. This is American Freedom Radio. Freedom, American Freedom Radio. American Freedom Radio.
And I hope people support American Freedom Radio. And I hope people vote with their dollars and really understand the value of having American Freedom Radio. Because that's my family. If you love me at all, Jack Blood, support American Freedom Radio. Like, my family has literally disowned me. American Freedom Radio, Danny and Don and those guys, those are my actual family. So please support these guys, because they have all the technology, they have all these great things that they're going to do, but obviously they can't do it all by themselves. So not only would I like to see you support them, I'd like to see you retweet them and repost them and really get involved and get on the bandwagon, so to speak, on doing that do-it-yourself promotion, because they're a do-it-yourself radio network, and we just need that so much.
Nutritious food is real body armor. It builds muscle, burns fat, improves digestion, and feeds the entire body the nutrients it needs. Did you know the U.S. government banned the hemp plant from growing in the United States and classified it as a Schedule I drug to hide it behind the marijuana plant? People have been confused about this plant for over 80 years, and many still don't know what hemp is. So now you know hemp is not marijuana, and marijuana is not hemp. They are different varieties of the same species. HempUSA.org wants the world to know these basic facts and to help people understand that hemp protein powder is the best kept health secret you need to know about. Remember, hemp protein powder contains 53% protein, is gluten-free, anti-inflammatory, non-GMO, and is loaded with nutrients. Call 888-910-4367, 888-910-4367, and see what our powder, seeds, and oil can do for you. Only at HempUSA.org.
This is Rick Simpson, and you're listening to American Freedom Radio.